Hello, welcome back. Okay, verbal communication module. This is so again, I don't know. Sometimes people watch these that aren't in my classes. So hi, I'm Lee Pierce. I'm a assistant professor of rhetoric in the Department of Communication at the State University of New York at Geneseo, which is upstate in New York by Rochester. I use she/they pronouns, and these videos are part of the modules that my interpersonal communication students watch to prep for class, but they're certainly, if you're into them, by all means, go ahead and watch. Okay, so this is the module that I think people find the most frustrating about the class because it's very heady and theoretical, but until you grasp at a very fundamental level the fact that the words that you are using do not have definitions, you will not get interpersonal communication. So I will say that again. The words we use don't have definitions. They don't have their own meaning that they carry around with them like a little suitcase, right? They're internally split among a bunch of different meanings, and the communication that happens with other people often, yes, happens because we meant one thing and they meant something else. But more importantly, it happens because our words are always internally contradictory. So we're just doing our best to try to fix the meaning of a word that fundamentally does not have meaning. And that is where 99% of communication error happens. And it's also the easiest thing, honestly, to fix through more intentional use of language. So I'm going to go over a couple theoretical concepts that I think really drive this point home, along with a few examples. And we will do some practice with this in the classroom. So for now, just think about a few key words from your study guide and start to try to wrap your head around some of these modules as you think about examples in your own life where you've used words or symbols or signs in a certain way and it hasn't gone the way you wanted and it was nobody's fault. This is trying to explain that phenomenon. So first of all, we call the words that you use, typically we call them signs, because a sign can be anything from a word like word. It can be a symbol like those little icons that you see on the outside of a bathroom. It can be an avatar like the icons that you use for your social media. It can be a piece of art. It can be something that someone says to you. It can be a noise, right? All those things are known as signs. Now, once upon a time, people believed that there were different kinds of signs. They believed on the one hand that there were these things called iconic or indexical signs, and that meant signs that had sort of like meanings in the world, right? They kind of had a relationship. So the easiest, and there are differences, but I'm just going to lump them all together. An icon is a sign that physically resembles what it stands for. So for example, oysters are often thought to have like libidinous, sex drive increasing properties because oysters look like sex organs, right? They're fleshy and they're squishy and they're slimy and they're gray and they're like kind of fat, right? I mean, they look like, I won't tell you what they look like, but they look like a sex organ, right? So for like many, many centuries, if not longer, there were many people that sort of just believed that because an oyster looks like that there must be a connection. That's what we call an icon. Now, an indexical sign is a sign that has a cause-effect relationship with someone. So if an animal growls, it means they're going to attack, whether that's playful or aggressive, kind of depends, but generally speaking, the growl can only mean one thing. Smoke means fire. So there are some signs, I think, that are not like rhetorical in the sense that they have multiple meanings and they don't have a necessary meaning. Those are not the signs that cause us problem in interpersonal communication. So I don't care about those signs. We're going to leave those alone. The problem is that most of us treat our signs, our words, as if they're that kind of a thing, right? So I say, I'm not happy with how things are going, and I just assume happy has just kind of a fixed meaning that everyone understands, and yeah, there might be some disagreement about how it's said, or it might be the tone of voice. No, it doesn't. Happy is a made-up arbitrary word that we just happen to have a bunch of meanings for, but it can mean a bunch of different things to different people, and if you walk around your life assuming that signs just have meaning, and you don't think about how complex and contradictory the meaning of every single sign is, you're going to constantly be miscommunicating with people. All right. So for example, if somebody yells to me like, fuck you, bitch, I instantly think that means you're angry and I have to react, right? It's as if there's no gap between what someone says and what I need to do or what it means, right? That's like instinct. That's an indexical or iconic sign. So I say I'm a woman and someone says, no, you're not, you were born a man, because woman must mean this very specific thing and man must mean this very specific other thing. That's another like form of indexical sign, right? Oh, you're a man because you were born with a penis and that's what you are. Like there's no gap, right? It's just like, it's a linear effect. And then men act XYZ, right? You see how just like the word man suddenly fixes a bunch of, and by fix I don't mean solves, but rather just holds in place. It orients a bunch of meanings that really are very variable and float around and are changeable and mutable and cultural, but we use the word to kind of hold on to just something that is certain. There's no gap between my language and what my language means. And we want there to be a gap because we want our words to be able to move around, to take on new meanings, to be flexible. But a lot of us kind of clutch the idea that words have to have certain meaning because we want there to be certainty. We don't want to have to deal with all of this discomfort. So let's say, for example, we live together and you say, hey, Lee, take out the garbage. And I say, okay. And then 20 minutes later, you're like, Lee, why haven't you taken out the garbage? And I'm like, well, I said I'd do it. I'll do it. And you're like, but I meant now. So you presumed that this very specific meaning of the phrase take out the garbage and my meaning of the word okay had this like only one meaning, which is I'll do it now. But to me, that meant something else. And that's not because we didn't communicate well, although that's certainly part of it. It's also because language just inherently like take out, it's not fixed to a time. It doesn't have a certain set of expectations. There's a gap there in what that could mean. And that fundamentally means that words don't have fixed meanings. They just have like contextual meanings. So so how real language works is that there's always a gap between what you think you mean and what you actually mean. That's just true. And yes, you can work harder to reduce the gap in your language so that you don't have as much miscommunication. But fundamentally, it's never going to go away. And getting used to that, and actually in some ways embracing that that's good for us, is the fundamental key to being an effective communicator. So signs can mean multiple things, and they often mean multiple contradictory things. That's why you've got to get really a really good grasp in order to get a hold of your verbal communication. So we have iconic and indexical signs, which are just signs that have no gap, right? There's a necessary and natural relationship between the thing we're looking at and the thing that it represents, okay? So like, for example, if you're highly religious, the Bible is the literal word of God. There's no gap. Or, sorry, I said religious and then I said Bible, right? So if you practice any kind of religion that has a sacred text, like the Quran, the Talmud, the Bible, then you're going to believe the Book of Mormon, right? You're going to believe that that's the literal word of God. It's an indexical or iconic sign. God said this, that's what this means. And that's fine. I can't like tell you that one of these texts is arbitrary because that gets into a whole other issue, but you can't treat your interpersonal communication that way because it's not true and it's not helpful in you becoming a better interpersonal communicator. So instead, we have this thing called the arbitrariness thesis. So if you've ever heard someone say like, oh, that you're being arbitrary, that means you're kind of just randomly making decisions with absolutely no basis in logic. That's arbitrariness. So arbitrariness of a sign means there's no logical or intrinsic relationship between the signifier and the signified. Okay. The signifier is the sound or the image. It's the like material essence of the word. So the word W-O-R-D, that's a signifier. You can see it in print. You can hear it come out of my mouth. But right now it's just kind of floating around in the ether, right? It doesn't yet have any meaning attached to it. It's just a signifier. The signified is the concept. So that's the collective meaning that we've all decided that signifier means. So for example, in English-speaking society, we've agreed that the signifier D-O-G refers to a four-legged animal with certain distinct features. But in an Urdu speech community society, the word DOG, the signifier DOG, is more often used for a person who shows their nature as like a criminal who's done something wrong or committed a crime and shown themselves to be a DOG, right? Now, we do have that use in English, like, oh, he's such a dog. But generally speaking, if we're walking around and I'm saying like, oh, you should meet Benji, my dog, you know that the signifier DOG means the four-legged person. But in another context, it could mean you should meet Benji. He's my criminal, poorly behaved person that I kind of keep around, right? Or he's my miscreant, misbehaving significant other. So a word always has two parts, and it's later we're going to talk about how it has three, but at a simple feature, right, there's the actual material piece of the word, and then there's the word dog. And that's why we can attach signifiers to new concepts, right? So a long time ago, queer, Queer, as a signifier was a word that just meant kind of like off. So people would say it very casually, like, oh, that's a very queer way of thinking about things, and it meant just kind of peculiar or out of logic, like bizarre. It meant like bizarre. Then that word starts to get attached to people who have alternate sexual orientations or alternate patterns of femininity and masculinity than the norm. So queer starts to become kind of a negative word, right? So you're queer, that's queer, don't be a queer. So now all of a sudden the signifier is the same, Queer, but it gets attached to a different signified. And now you have both of those meanings. So sometimes I'll read a speech that I really like and they'll use the word queer just kind of in a very like basic context. But because it's got this new signified, you can't just say like, oh, I mean the old signified, because signifieds are additive, so that you keep getting more and more signifieds attached to a signifier, and you're responsible. So every time I now use the word Queer, I'm responsible for all of the signifieds that are attached to it. I don't get to just say, oh, well, I only want the one signified and not the other. This is not like a choose your own menu where you can go and pick like half of a soup and part of a salad. No, you get what the meal plan is. This is what you get. It's the one meal for everybody. You don't get to like customize it, right? You can say you're going to customize it, but you don't get a choice in how your language circulates in the world. So then queer starts to become like a word that people want to reclaim. So now it has just a descriptive word. So sometimes when we're trying to refer to LGBTQIAA plus individuals, people will just say queer, even though queer is part of that chain because it's faster. So it's not necessarily bad or good. It's just a descriptive word. So now we have another signified. And then on top of that, some people reclaim the word queer as like an empowerment word, the same way that people like reclaim like bitch. Like, what's up, bitch, right? It's kind of a reclaim word. Where if somebody called me a bitch, that would be very different. Same signifier, right? Multiple signifieds attached to that signifier. And then there are people in the community who might be considered queer who do not like referring to themselves that way. So that's yet another signified. So all these signifieds start to hang out together and they all get attached to the same exact signifier, Queer. And when you use that word, you don't get to choose which of those signifieds you want to bring with it. The whole thing comes. It's like when you get into a relationship with someone, you don't get to pick and choose which part of their family or which part of their friend group shows up with them. They bring the whole shebang. And if you can't get on board with the whole shebang, then you should just not meet that person, because you're going to spend the rest of your life trying to like pick and choose which parts you get to keep, and that is just not how it works. And it's very similar with language. The arbitrariness thesis, right? So the idea that words do not have meaning, like real literal meaning, they just have various signifieds to which they get attached over time. That doesn't mean, that doesn't really matter when words make sense, right? Even though dog, D-O-G, signifier can mean a bunch of different things, if I tell you like, hey, I just get a dog, or hey, we should, go look at dogs, it's like, whatever, you're good, we understand each other. So a lot of times we don't notice how arbitrary words are, because much of the time words, our verbal communication, our signs and our symbols, they just work. I mean, we would have abandoned the English language system a long time ago if they didn't work. So when arbitrariness doesn't matter, then fine, don't worry about it. It's not causing you problems. The issue is that arbitrariness is the thing that causes a lot of your miscommunication problems. So for example, if I meet you and we move in together and I'm like, hey, we should really get a dog. And you're like, yes, I would love a dog. But I'm imagining this little shrimpy, chihuahua, snarky, yippy little rat dog, right? I don't like dogs, by the way. So not that I don't like them. I'm not a dog owner, but obviously I love all animals. And you're imagining this like big strapping German shepherd who's going to guard the door and like go out for long walks and be very obedient. When the time comes to finally make that decision, you're going to have trouble because you were using the same signifier, but you had attached it to different signifieds, right? Different concepts. So even though you both have a general concept of what dog is, when it comes down to the practicalities, there are so many different types of dogs there's so many signifieds attached to that signifier that it doesn't work for you, right? You weren't being intentional in your language. You used the word dog, which could mean a lot of things, and you were being lazy because that's how human beings are. And then you created miscommunication, not because you meant to or because you weren't clear, but just because that's how language works. So part of that is, as you're communicating with people, if there are higher stakes, you have to use the language that is most clear about what signified it is that you intend to attach it to. And sometimes we'll use this to our advantage, right? So if I say, I'll take out the trash later, I know perfectly well later is vague, and I'm taking advantage of the fact that that has a lot of different signifieds because I'm hoping you'll just stop nagging me about it. Because really by later, I mean sometime that's not now, but I don't mean in the next 30 minutes. And so I will say that because I don't want to say, I will take out the trash when I feel like it, which is probably going to be when it starts to smell. Now that's much clearer about what I mean so that there's no miscommunication. But of course, I don't want to say that because then you're going to be like, well, I really need to take it out now. And then we're going to have that fight. So part of the problem is we like to pretend that words have literal meanings when it suits us. And then acknowledge that they don't when it doesn't suit us, right? And you can't choose. I mean, again, you can be unethical and use language in shady ways, but that's not what I'm teaching you. All right. So most of our interpersonal problems when we communicate stem from the arbitrariness thesis, and our collective, just kind of like socially for some reason as a culture, we don't talk enough about how words don't have meanings. We spend a lot of time arguing about how words have meanings. So we spend a lot of time arguing about, like, for example, I think politics is a good example. We spend a lot of time fighting about, like, what is true instead of spending more time talking about how there is no truth and how do we want to think about things, which is, like, what a rhetorical perspective does. So we need to realize that words don't have meanings, and we all need to do a lot more work making sense to each other. So let's take the sign, and I call them signs, I don't call them words typically, sign, or signifier. The sign has multiple parts, right? The sign has the signifier and the signified, and then we're going to add another thing to it in a minute. But the sign is the signifier and the signified. So the sign is that whole relationship of things that you use whenever you give someone a sign. So the sign student, for example, like, my students, be a good student. This is what I think of when I think of a student. That's a sign. And then you've got the signifier, which is the word student, and it typically is the same signifier for everyone. And then you've got it's signified, or it's kind of collective, like what do we mean when we say student? So what's the signified there? Well, for me, the signified of the signifier student is an individual who works at least part-time at an internship or a paid job or whatever, has a lot of competing demands on their time. Maybe they have a family. Maybe they're really into a certain sport. Maybe they're taking a lot more classes because they're trying to make up the difference. Maybe they have to go home and take care of a family, right? Like not their own family, but an extended family or someone who needs their support. They don't know necessarily how to do college. Maybe they didn't go to the best high school, or maybe they did go to the best high school, but they didn't take advantage of the classes. But I mean, for some reason or another, college is a very stressful, weird place for them. And of course, college is another signifier that has many signifieds, even though we use that word, like I'm using it right here as if it makes sense, but it could mean 100 things. My student didn't learn a lot of habits that they need to succeed while they were in high school. They didn't learn thought management. They didn't learn money management. They didn't learn assertiveness. They didn't learn about verbal constructs and how to clarify their meaning. They love to use new technology and social media, and they have seen the television show Crazy Ex-Girlfriend, which I reference all the time. They hate checking their email, and when they have a question or they're confused about something or they don't know what they're doing, they will ask if they have trouble. My student in my head, when I think of that signifier, also speaks English as a first language and has mild to moderate challenges producing constructive internal self-talk, but not serious challenges. Generally speaking, the habits that they have when they think about themselves, they can change, right? They don't have any like major mental health challenges that are keeping them from being able to change their thoughts and actions. So if you're an student in my class where I make policies and create assignments and talk to you and try to relate to you, that's great if you're that person, right? If you meet every single specific signified that goes into that signifier, that's awesome for you, right? Because in all of the policies and the references I make and the way I explain material and the interpersonal strategies I use fit you. But what if like you spent 2 years in a study skills class in high school? Then you might be bored or feel like I'm being condescending. And what if you hate technology, or you use like a really old cell phone because you're environmentally conscious, or you don't have the money to upgrade? Then all the Slack and Canvas and all that nonsense causes you way more problems than if I gave you like an email attachment syllabus and just emailed you everything you need to know, right? What if you've never seen Crazy Ex-Girlfriend, which a lot of you haven't? I mean, I know that, but again, every time I choose an example to illustrate something to you, I'm pretending as if you're going to get that example, because that's all part of the signified. Then you won't get my references. And if you struggle with English because you speak another language, then you probably feel very overwhelmed by me, because I'm a highly competent English language user. And so I speak and write as if people on the other end understand what I'm saying. And if you have a serious mental health condition that makes it hard for you to be sort of intentional with your self-talk, like untreated bipolarism or severe depression, or if you have like borderline personality disorder, for example, then what I'm saying to you is going to feel like too little, too late, right? So I'm telling you, oh, change your self-talk and use the model, and well, why don't you just think this thought instead of this other thought? And you're just like, yeah, if I could do that, I wouldn't need this model. So again, here's the problem with the arbitrariness thesis of signs, because signifieds get attached to signifiers, and that's great if the signifieds match your life experience, but if they don't, then you're excluded from using that language. The solution, of course, is just to build these huge, complex, flexible schema for every single signifier in every language. So for student, I just need to have like an ever-evolving schema for that, where every time I encounter a new type of student, they go into my filing cabinet, right? But I still have to make policy decisions, and I still have to decide what kind of student am I appealing to in this class, and I have to make decisions, and I have to interact with you, and I have to decide what's the late work policy, and what kinds of assignments are you going to do, and what kinds of resources am I going to give you. I mean, that's the salience issue. I have to choose certain things to explain to you and to make you aware of, because I can't tell you every single thing about interpersonal communication that ever existed. I have to pick, and in order to pick, I have to know my signified. So I'm going to make choices about what belongs to that signifier that don't fit you, right? Which is fundamentally unethical, and also the only way that I can do it. So when we have to make those decisions, we necessarily have to leave out more things than we include, and the mental definition or schema that I've built for the signifier student in my head is going to directly impact our relationship for the rest of the semester, just like you're eventually going to build a schema for professor. And what is that person to you? Is that a person who never answers email? Is that a person who is that a signifier that means super approachable? Is that a signifier that means someone who's going to help me with my career plans? Is that a signifier of someone who wants to like see me fail? I mean, is that person white? Does that matter? These things all go into your signifier. You can't help it. So pretending as if words are just like these neutral things that we just use to communicate, it just fundamentally misunderstands how language works. So when you label the word, so whenever you use a signifier, you bring all of these assumptions and expectations that go with it. Because when you just say like, oh, to the students in the class, oh, or to like welcome all students, or we need to work on student retention, when you just say all that, you leave all of that stuff implicit. So this is the fundamental reason why we invent new language, right? Because we need to name new kinds of signifiers that are better at changing the attached signifieds. For example, a minoritized, non-traditional first-generation student who works in parents is different than just student. Because when you say student, you're just going to leave implicit all of those assumptions that you have to make when you use that word. And when you label the word, you bring those assumptions to the forefront. And if you don't do that work, then when you just say the word student, what you're really saying is white, able-bodied, great brain chemistry, blank slate, highly literate, upper middle class, technologically privileged, studying is their full-time job, all they want to do is learn, the great thoughts that I have coming out of my brain, so please just sit there and listen to me and absorb all my knowledge like a sponge. Student, right? That's just how language works. And so when you're using signifiers, part of it is just checking that what you mean by certain signifiers that are contentious, other people mean. And part of it is choosing new language, because sometimes you have a signifier that's got so many signifieds attached to it that it doesn't work anymore as just a simple word. So you have to be more specific. And like recently, for example, we started to call Geneseo a PWI, which means predominantly white institution, This is the first year I've heard people say PWI as often as they have been. And it's not because like they're trying to be politically correct. It's because that's what this is. It's a place where it's mostly white people. And we need to label that, because if not, then those assumptions and expectations are buried and it causes more problems than it fixes, because college at a predominantly white institution looks different than college at a predominantly black or historically black college and universities, or a place that sort of has equal racial diversity. So let's go back to this idea of like, well, you're just being politically correct. So, or like, oh, well, that's just semantics. People say that to me all the time. Well, you're just arguing about semantics. Yeah, it's all fucking semantics, okay? Semantics is literally all that this is. And I don't say this stuff to be politically correct. I really do not give a shit about political correctness. I care about meaning and meaning what I say and being intentional so that I do the best job I can of making it so that the words that come out of my mouth have signifieds attached to them that I believe in and that I support and that I want to put out into the universe. I mean, when you use words, they're like little idea bombs. So every time you throw a word out into culture, I don't care if you're like gaming on Xbox or doing a lecture that's going to go on YouTube or talking to a friend, when you put those words out into the world, you are essentially exploding little meaning bombs, and you are responsible for all of the debris and wreckage that comes out of that bomb. So, you have a choice. So don't come at me with this, oh, well, isn't there such a thing as being too PC nonsense? This doesn't have anything to do with being PC. It has to do with using language in a purposeful way that creates the meanings that you want, instead of being lazy and careless and just letting your implicit assumptions float around because you don't want to be responsible for them. All words are choices. Every sign that you put into the world is a choice. Words are not passive objects that just circulate meanings. They aren't dollar bills that have a standardized currency. So like with $1, you can give somebody $1 and you kind of have an equivalent exchange value, right? Words don't work like that. Different words are going to get you different currencies. And I will also add that the only thing that makes a dollar bill or gold or a cigarette in Shawshank Redemption valuable is that people believe it has value. If people just stop believing the dollar bill means anything, it won't mean anything. It will have no value. You will be able to buy nothing for it. Just like ask people in Argentina, for example, who have woken up one day and just found that millions of pesos suddenly have no value because they don't believe in them anymore, right? Same thing with stocks. Stocks don't have value. They're just arbitrary currency that float around. Words work similar ways. And if we believe that a word has a lot of value, it's going to. So words like student tend to have a lot of value for us because they connote certain types of students, right? They connote like hardworking, typically white, literate, highly like pre-educated students. And as a professor, that makes my job a lot easier because if you're that kind of a student, I can just give you really long lectures with really complicated concepts. I can talk to you about stuff that I think is interesting. I don't have to help you. I don't have to reach out to you. You're responsible for your own success and failure. It's your job if you can't get to class or can't do stuff, and I just give you tests and assume you've learned everything and read the book and gone to the lecture and taken the notes, and then whatever happens, happens. That's what happens when we let certain signifiers stand without examining their signifieds, right? We stop being careful with how we behave to make sure that we are doing what we want to do. Now, if you want to be the kind of person who just does whatever you want to do, fine. Then honestly, I don't even know why you take this class because it's just fundamentally like that's not interpersonal communication. That's just like narcissistic, egomaniac, fascist behavior where the whole world exists to serve you and what you want and you shouldn't have to try and everyone else should just show up the way that you expect them to. And if that's your attitude, like cool, good luck with that. This is not the class for you. And I don't say that in the like, you can't succeed in this class. I say like you just don't have an attitude of willingness to meet people where they are with language. You just want to be entitled to use language the way you want. And that is a fundamentally anti-relational attitude to have. All right. So just like any other commodity, like the dollar bill, words or signs have exchange value. You give words and you get meaning. Some words get more meaning, some get less meaning. So the reason we use the reason we use the word signifier student is not only because it keeps us from having to uncomfortably examine what we mean by that word, like our implicit assumptions about what a student is, because if we think about that stuff, we have to change how we behave. But also because it's faster. Like we just get more meaning for less effort. The word student has a lot more exchange value than student who parents. right? So we tend to use words with high exchange value because we get maximum meaning for minimal effort. That's the principle of efficiency. Exchange value is also the reason why, even though words have no inherent meaning, you can't just use any sign you want in any way. I can't suddenly like point to a table and say that it's a cat. I mean, words have no inherent meaning. They're arbitrary, but they also have historical context, and they've been circulated in certain ways over time. So you can't just suddenly decide a word has a totally different meaning and people are just going to believe that. All right, so let's just review the two characteristics of a sign we've talked about. The sign is arbitrary. There's no natural or given reason why a signifier, which is the sound or the image material, SIG, right, the sign, is linked to a particular signified, except history and custom and culture, right? But there's no like necessary or absolute reason for that. Also, the sign is relational. A sign only makes sense in relation to other signs in the same system, right? That's the exchange value. We can't use a sign that has no circulation value. Just like I can't walk up to someone and go like, oh, I'd like to purchase a bag of groceries with half of this used bottle of lotion. People would be like, yeah, we don't take half-used cosmetics as currency. Now, in a barter system, we do, right? But we'd have to haggle. How much is a pound of rice worth in terms of half-used bottle of lotion? And there are lots of barter economies that still happen. You know, Craigslist is a barter economy a lot of the time, although usually people use money. But if you go to the exchange and barter section, you can actually barter services. And part of that bartering, though, is you have to spend a lot of time explaining why something is worth something, and you have to negotiate. And that's really how language should work. I mean, frankly, for every word that we want to use, we should have to negotiate what we agree is its fixed meaning for that specific context, because that's what would clarify our meanings with each other. But that would take such a long, arduous amount of effort. Nobody would ever do that. But don't get it twisted. Just because words historically have certain exchange values, that's just an accident. It just happened through custom, but that's not the way it actually is. All right, so we've talked about how the sign is binary, right? So the sign has the signifier, and then it has the signified. But actually, that's just the basic version. The semantic triangle, which is the next theory we're going to talk about, states that signs are actually trinary. They are internally split among three parts, right? So this is the semantic triangle, or the triangle of meaning, or the triangle of reference. And understanding it is going to be everything when it comes to you being able to be a competent interpersonal communicator. So we've got the signifier. The signifier is the sound pattern, like O-R-A-N-G-E, orange, right? That's the written spoken word, the visual symbol, whatever. Sometimes we call that part the sign, but that's confusing. The whole thing is the sign. Some signs are words. We already went over this, and some signs are symbols. So the sign, though, is the relationship among all of these parts. And the signifier is the part of the sign that's just the material word on paper. For me, calling the words that I use signifiers instead of like words or signs is helpful because it reminds me that those words can point to multiple things at the same time. One of the best things that I think you can do for your interpersonal communication is always remember to clarify that you've used a signifier and like, can we confirm which concept or which signified you think that means? So for example, when I use the signifier family, I try to make sure I'm distinguishing between family of origin and family of orientation, right? Because for some people, the family that they think of when they think of family is not the family that they got in the beginning. It's also not their biological family. It could be their created family, right? I also try not to use the signifier parent, parent, because that connotes like heterosexual biological parents, typically who are still together, typically who have this kind of like investment in your life that's not really true in everyone's experience. You might notice that other signifiers that tend to throw you off when I use them. So if I tend to use a signifier that has a signified that I'm assuming that you're like, yeah, that's not really my signified, that's good stuff to bring to my attention because I will fix that for you. So signifiers, which are the material, they have two different things that they're attached to simultaneously. We've already talked about how signifiers have signifieds. These are concepts. These are kind of the collectively agreed upon mental images that float around. Like the signifier M-O-T-H-E-R, mother. In my cultural context means like this warm, loving woman who's alive and present in your life and takes care of your problems and kind of like gets sad when you don't call her, right? My M-O-T-H-E-R mother has been dead for a while. However, so that's not my signified. When I think mother, I think like horrible, heart-wrenching absence. That thought, that horrible, heart-wrenching absence, is my referent. That's my real thing that my signifier, M-O-T-H-E-R, points to. At the same time, it's pointing to this concept of this alive woman who is present for like multiple life events and stuff. Now, you can imagine how for me, when Mother's Day shows up, that signifier, M-O-T-H-E-R, is pointing to all of these signifieds that have nothing to do with my real life experience. So I have to sit around and deal with the ambiguity and discomfort that this word mother that has this like strong feeling and meaning for me means one thing for everyone else, but this other thing for me. And it also has this other meaning for me. It's not like I didn't feel that way about my mother, right? Because in my brain, I have both concept and referent. Everyone has the concept, right? And again, like we talked about, it's multiple signifieds. So there are multiple signifieds going on with mother. And then there's your referent. And so as people, the more that the signifieds that float around don't take our referent into account, the more and more we feel alienated from language. And that's how we get to feel alienated from culture. So the referent is the like concrete thing that's being referred to. So an actual chair would be the chair would be the referent of the word chair. But of course, there are many, many signifieds for the words chair. The referent of words such as table or building is like pretty clear, but some referents are more abstract, like happiness or danger, right? So happiness has so many signifieds, and we all have them in our head, right? Signifieds are collective, so we all share them. But then we all have specific reference about what makes us happy. And so, of course, if your referent for happy and your signified for happy are different, then your brain has like a lot of discomfort around the fact that the signifieds that you have and the reference that you have don't match up. So let's like simplify all this and just review using the sign orange. So O-R-A-N-G-E is your signifier. As in, when you go to the store, will you get me some orange juice? So you've got the signifier orange, O-R-A-N-G-E. That's the material thing. What's the signified? Well, it's like a color, it's a fruit. You have like sunsets in your mind. Maybe there's a certain color of paper. I mean, this is where it gets really interesting because we all have kind of similar collective signifieds. Maybe you see like a certain thing of orange juice on the shelf. I mean, right, all these signifieds start to happen, and we'd probably, if we did this in class and mapped it out, we'd all probably have a lot of similar signifieds. But now think about like in the sentence, when you go to the store, will you get me some orange juice? What is the referent? With pulp, without pulp, fresh pressed, the expensive stuff, the cheap stuff that comes from concentrate, the frozen kind you like to mix yourself so you can add water, Sunny D, orange Kool-Aid, right? Because some people call Kool-Aid juice. That's just how they talk about it. So now all of a sudden you start to realize how the referent and the signified don't match up, but yet they all belong to this signifier of orange. So now you show up and you come home with the wrong orange juice because neither one of us clarified our referent. That's just like a little tiny idea of what happens when we use other words like let's start a family or I would like you to meet my parents, right? When we think about much more loaded signifiers that we use in interpersonal communication, think how much more complex that gets if at a basic fundamental level we can't even really agree on what the word orange means. So then, here's where it gets crazy. Some signifiers don't even have reference. They just have signifieds. So for example, and I'm going to get political here because I think it's helpful. My father believes that there are all of these illegal immigrants coming over the border into America and stealing our jobs. And so I asked him, Dad, what illegal immigrant have you ever met who has stolen a job that you wanted? He hasn't, and they didn't, right? He has this is not a thing. He has no referent. He has a sign, illegal immigrant, right? And it has the signifier, illegal immigrant, right, the word concept, and it has a signified person from Mexico illegally entering the country, like taking the jobs an American want, they have a bunch of kids, right, all this stuff. But he has like no referent or actual concrete example from this thing. So he's just got the signified and no referent. And as part of that semantic triangle, we've also got other signs in that system, like Mexico, like illegal, like Americans, like jobs, and then these verbs like taking, right, which all contribute to this belief system that my father has when he has no referent for that belief system. So in other words, the signified has become so like deeply ingrained as true in his brain that he just imagines that the referent is real. And then even if he were to meet a referent, Like if he actually met an illegal immigrant who was coming over and trying to apply for his job, he wouldn't even be able to notice the particulars of that particular referent because it would already be part of the signified, right? The signified would already dictate how he saw the referent. That's stereotyping. We talked about that in the other module. Don't do that shit. So here's a less politicized version. Well, except that it's all political. So there's a meme that I love. I can post it for you. That says, when Bae tells you something. So it's like, I see it on Instagram, right? It just says, when Bae, B-A-E, tells you something. So Bae is like your person, right? Your boo thing. So when Bae tells you something. Under signifier, the meme says what she says. So Bae is a woman here, and that matters. Under signified, it's what you think she means, right? So the signifier is what she says. So Bae tells you like blah, blah, yada, yada. The signifier is literally the material things that come out of her mouth, right? The signified is what you think she means. That's kind of the collective belief that, oh, well, when someone says this thing, it must mean this. And then the referent is what she really means that you kind of don't know. So let's suppose you get home and Bae, like whatever gender Bae is for you, says, we need to talk. So there's your signifier. W-E-N-E-E-D-T-O-T-A-L-K. Signifier. The signified, of course, is this whole like collective belief we have that anytime anyone says anything like that, especially women, if they say like we need to talk, it means something like super dramatic and bad, like you're in trouble or you're going to break up or you've done something wrong and now they're going to hold it over your head, right? This is this collective image we have. It's in the media. We talk about it. We make jokes about it. It's in stand-up comedy. Bae doesn't ever need to have even said we need to talk, right? They don't even need to have ever said it before or even say it in a weird way or you'd have any experience with this particular person saying this particular signifier for you to still assume that this is what's about to happen. So you're all in your feelings about your presumed signified and we haven't even gotten to a referent yet. They could be saying, we need to talk, I really want to get a cat. Or we need to talk, I don't want to watch Game of Thrones anymore because it's getting rapey, right? Any of those could be the reference. But you're already so into your signified and your feelings about the signified before the referent even makes its appearance. So part of that is that if I'm the person who's saying we need to talk, I should probably be aware that there's a signified that goes with that, and I probably should think about clarifying my signifier. But part of it is that if you're getting a signified and you don't have a sense of what the like referent is, you need to be careful because you don't want to start interpreting people's words based on the collective meanings that you have for them. Also, so what I think is cool in this meme though is that there's a second sign system, and it's the sign system around like she who is Bae who is woman, right? So like Bae is a certain kind of sign, and of course Bae is always gendered woman. The signifier is the word B-A-E or S-H-E, right? That's your signifier. The signified, based on this meme, is like this person who's a woman, right, who doesn't like say what they mean, and they're trying to be all difficult and they're dramatic, and that's a widely circulating stereotype, just like bitches be making you guess what they mean, and like if you don't get it, they're going to be all like, well, if you don't know, I'm certainly not going to tell you. So there's that whole signified. And then of course, if the stereotype circulates widely enough about that signified, you start to get in your head that like all women are like this. And of course, this is a very race, like Bae is a raced woman, or it's a black woman. Typically people aren't walking around calling each other Bae, at least not since the mid 2000s, calling each other Bae who are not people of color. And again, this is all part of that signified signifier. Are there a reference where white people are Bae? Absolutely. But generally speaking, when we think about the signified of this image, this stereotype, we're thinking of the dramatic, overly sassy, right, black woman. That's the signified that goes with the signifier B-A-E. So then you start to like, of course, as this stereotype circulates, you start to get it in your head that like this is what they're actually like. Not because you actually have enough referent to make that argument, but because you just believe in the signified so much that you just think it's true. So whether it's a woman or a black woman or just some dramatic partner or whatever, even if you meet a concrete referent, right? Even if you meet someone who, like your friend's romantic partner that they call Bae, who's not a woman, or maybe they're a trans woman or whatever, maybe they're a lesbian, and they're not dramatic, and when they say we need to talk, they mean it in a very like reasonable way, you can't see that referent because it goes directly against your signified, which is the she who just like is so dramatic, as opposed to someone who just means what they say and uses the phrase we need to talk to alert someone that they'd like their attention. So you can't see the referent for what it is because the referent is always a product of the signifier that floats around alongside it. In fact, the reference is often, in some of these situations, in direct contradiction to the signifier. So sometimes you'll have a referent who's like, yeah, I'm nothing like that. And you can't even see that because it's so different from the signified that you've been floating around with that you can't recognize that fact. That's stereotyping. We talked about that in the other module. Don't do that shit. So now we've got the semantic triangle down. And I know that this was a long one, but man, it's really complicated. And people have this is why I call this the brain fuckery lesson, because people have a really hard time with the concept that not only do words not have meanings, they actually have multiple contradictory internal meanings, and that there's no amount of communication that is going to solve this problem. It's just permanent. It's just how language works. So, however, the good news is that there is something you can do with this. So, because part of what happens then is that you when you use words that have a lot of signifieds. So the more signifieds a word has attached to it. So if we think of signifiers like American, cool, nice, student, success, right? If you think about those signifiers, SUCCESS, the more signifieds that it has kind of in it. So if you think of every word as like a picnic basket, the more signifieds that are hanging out in the picnic basket, we call that word more abstract because it means that it has more meanings associated with it. It has high exchange value, right? You get more meaning when you throw around the word bae than when you throw around like, oh, my highly rational trans girlfriend who just likes to make sure that I'm paying attention when we have a serious discussion. That's the referent. That's like a very specific thing. You don't get a lot of meaning. Like not a lot of people are going to be like, oh, I know, right? Like nobody's going to put that when significant other who is highly rational and blah, blah, blah says we need to talk as a meme on the internet because it wouldn't get any, right? Memes are highly abstract and they rely on a lot of these signifiers with a lot of concepts, a lot of signifieds floating around in them. However, as you slide down, you start to get into more concrete language, more referent language that doesn't have nearly as much meaning and it takes a lot more thought and a lot more energy and you don't get it nearly as wide a circulation, but it's a lot more specific to what you're imagining and it takes into account the signifieds that you don't want to attach yourself to. So we're kind of creating this like relationship between the abstract level of communication and the more concrete level, and we call that your ladder of abstraction. So the ladder of abstraction is a mental model that helps you think about the signs that you're using and the kinds of meaning that you're going to get in exchange for those signs. The model describes varying levels of abstraction toward the top and concreteness toward the bottom, and it helps kind of describe how our languages and thoughts make sense. The higher up the ladder you are, the more abstract the idea, language, or thought is. The higher up the ladder, the more exchange value you're like to get for your words. For example, awesome, freedom, education, all high on the ladder of abstraction. And although no word really belongs at the bottom or top, because certainly freedom in some contexts could be more concrete, it all is relative to the language, to the sort of words in the system that you're using. The lower you are on the ladder, the more concrete the idea, language, or thought is, right? So specific people, names, places tend to be concrete, but like I'll give you an example, Martin Luther King Jr., very abstract. Many, many, many signifieds associated with Martin Luther King Jr. Stokely Carmichael, also a civil rights leader, also a proper name, lived about Martin Luther King Jr.'s time, maybe a little bit later. Very concrete, because that particular name hasn't circulated widely enough to have any like signifieds really attached to it, right? It's more of a referent. Another example, Anne Frank. Lots of signifieds attached to Anne Frank, right? Zlata Vlaticek, who was the Anne Frank of the 90s, who died after writing a diary of her life in the Bosnia-Herzegovinian War in the 90s. Very referent, very concrete, right? So again, if I use the word Anne Frank, the name, as a way to kind of signify a bunch of ideas, I'm going to have a lot of signifieds that are going to come along for the ride that I'm going to have to control for. So the downside is that if I use Zlata as my example of whatever it is that I want to teach, I have the benefit of there being no preconceived notion, so I can kind of make Zlata mean what I need Zlata to mean without having to worry about all the signifieds. But I also don't get the benefit of you bringing some pre-understanding to the situation, so I lose out on like the power of the referent. All right, so you can also think about the ladder as like zooming out, which is abstraction, and like zooming in, which is concreteness. Okay, so that's the ladder. The biggest problem for most of us is that our communication tends to be way too much on one end of the ladder of the other. So like when we're having a fight with someone, we're talking about how you always make us feel this way, or you never want to do this thing. That's very abstract. It's very general. It doesn't give us any specifics. Or we get all bogged down on the specifics, like how you didn't wash the dishes tonight, when it's really not about the dishes. It's about how you don't feel like you have equal say in the relationship. So you're not being abstract enough because you're getting so bogged down in like the details of the dishes. So another example is you're in a job interview and you're trying to like relate and get hired and have effective communication, but also be likable. And so you talk about how you're team-oriented and you're a good communicator and you're detail-oriented and you work hard. But you don't have any examples. You don't like say what those things mean. That's super abstract. Or you ramble on and on and on about specific details of this particular job you did, or how your camera works, or this internship that you had, but you're not kind of leveling that up to make sense of what you would be like as an employee or a coworker, or what you mean for the organization. So you're too much on the low ladder. So likewise, when you talk about whole groups of people and these vague abstractions like foreigners or black people or conservatives or immigrants or whatever, and you don't recognize the very, very different concrete and particular instances that challenge those generic groupings. That's called stereotyping. We talked about that in Module 1. Don't do that shit. So to be a competent communicator, and again, remember, competence includes efficiency, and efficiency is getting the most meaning for the least amount of effort. And I will say, a lot of times, the kind of communication I'm asking you to do, which is highly ethical and highly intentional, it's low on efficiency. So you're only going to be able to do it so much, right? You can only be so intentional of a communicator. In fact, I would be very interested to know, based on this video, which signifiers I've been using that are very unintentional and help and cause confusion for you, because that's an example of where I was trying to be efficient. Because I can't be intentional, ethical about every single word that comes out of my mouth. Because if I do, we're never going to get anything done. You would have to watch these videos for the rest of time, and I still wouldn't be done. So remember that competence is always multiple different things at the same time, and you can't have all of them. So in this sense, when I say competence, I'm really meaning more like ethical, more creative, more socially expressive, right? I'm not really meaning as much efficient. But that's still part of the deal. So I am acknowledging, of course, that what I'm asking you to do is just a constant ongoing process. You're never going to be able to do it perfectly. So to be a competent communicator, you need to be able to climb up and down the ladder of abstraction strategically in a pattern that makes sense, not just like randomly jump from conclusions to details. Communicating at one level of abstraction, like too much at the top or too much at the bottom, is known as dead level abstracting. Dead level, meaning you don't slide, you just stay in one place. It results in a very like unbalanced form of communication that's less engaging, and also it doesn't challenge your mind, because part of the way that people avoid like the hard work of communicating and thinking new thoughts is they stay either too much into the details or too much into the abstraction. And so, for example, if you've ever spent time with someone who has Alzheimer's or maybe has dementia, you'll notice that they're either repeating a lot of things that are very like cliche and abstract. Maybe they're talking about like the war, or my grandmother, for example, when she was losing her memory and she was in dementia, but she didn't have yet full-blown Alzheimer's, she talked a lot about like being a Cornell woman because she went to Cornell. Ugh, she reminds me about it. Well, she used to remind me about it all the time. I tried to go to Cornell. I definitely did not pass my classes. I could not go back. All right. So she's a Cornell woman. So she uses this like very abstract cliche phrase to mean a bunch of things about her. She also would talk about like the day that she heard after the movie that the U.S. had joined the war. She's dead level abstracting because she can't think about moving up and down the ladder. Like, what does it mean about the war? What's the implication of that? What is the specifics? She can't move along the ladder. So while you're like, have a healthy brain, and again, I'm making assumptions here, right? I'm even making assumption about your grandmother, right? Grandmother is a signifier. And I'm talking about my referent of grandmother, but who knows when that encounters the collective signifier of grandmother, how that's going to feel. So it's a constant struggle. So if you don't spend time moving up and down the ladder, you don't challenge your brain to think interesting thoughts. And that's not only how you get sick, it's also how you wind up being just like a very superficial, uninteresting person who doesn't have creative solutions to very important problems, which in theory is why you went to COLLEGE, to use that signifier again, right? You went there to learn higher level thinking. So if you don't learn how to slide up and down the ladder of abstraction, what are you doing here? And I mean that in the hope, like, I hope you'll say like, oh, I want to learn this, not you'll just give up and quit. So that's never my intention. But you know, it's important to realize that you didn't just come here so you could like get a job and make although that's important to people. I mean, I want you to be employed and I want you to be able to pay your bills. And for many of you, you've got people depending on you to become financially independent to be able to care for them. But I think you can do all of that stuff while also thinking about being intentional with your language, right? So one of the ways you do that is you slide up and down the ladder of abstraction strategically. So when you're so here are some examples of being stuck at the bottom of the ladder, right? This is only concrete. So for example, if you come to a lesson and I just keep talking about like the Marxist theory of dialectics and who Marx was and how he developed the theory of historical materialism and why his exchange value versus labor value, use value didn't take up with the Hegelian Kantians. And okay, you see what I'm doing right now? I'm stuck at the bottom of the ladder. By the way, all that stuff is real. It all helps inform the lesson that I'm giving you, but I've omitted that part because the exchange value of language comes from the Marxist theory of labor value. But I omit that because it's too much concreteness. So a project manager, for example, talks about the budget and effort data in precision, but doesn't like tell you what that data means. Or you go to like a training and they talk all about like how to use Canvas and what the details of Canvas are, but they don't sort of show you how to organize that stuff into specific assignments. So you get a lot of details and not a lot of so what. If you're stuck at the top of the ladder, which is like all abstraction, this is like a politician who proposes a series of these like generic legislative reforms. And sorry, I wanted to check how long I've been talking. Whew, it's a long one. Okay. But fails to address how that legislation will like have impacts or how we're going to do it or how we're going to pay for it. A university professor contrasts competing academic theories, but doesn't like use any practical examples, which I'm sure is one that you're very, very familiar with. That is stuck way too much at the top of the ladder. So your mind, as well as the people who are communicating with you, need both concrete details and abstract principles and lessons, and they need them in a clearly organized, logical way. You can't just like bounce between them. So you want to be able to climb up the ladder of abstraction, hang out there for a minute, and then climb back down the ladder of abstraction. So in order to climb down the ladder of abstraction, embrace the phrase, for example, right? Provide real-world examples. Use sensory language, so touch, hear, taste, smell, and as well as what we call third-person objective language, which is like, I said blah, blah, blah. I thought blah, blah, blah. Then I slammed the door. That's sensory language, as opposed to I got mad and I left, which is much higher in abstraction because I can't really see what you're talking about. You've got your stories, you've got anecdotes, you've got data, you've got statistics, you've got case studies, you've got research, you've got testimony, you've got quotes. That stuff is all concrete. You need to use that to support your higher level abstractions. Concrete thought answers the how questions. So you can ask questions like, how does this work? What would this look like if I saw it? How would I know this if I saw it? So those are all questions that ask you to slide down the ladder of abstraction. Now, once you've hung out in the down part of the ladder of abstraction for a couple sentences or a bit, right, you want to move back up the ladder of abstraction because you want to kind of be zooming out and zooming in order to make certain points clear. So if you tend to get lost in the details, you need to climb up the ladder. And so here are some strategies you use to climb up the ladder. Answer, why is this important? So like, who cares? So what, right? Provide the big picture. You can show patterns or relationships or themes so that your audience can see how the different ideas connect to other people and your lives. You can give them principles or guidelines, right? Like what are the rules or what are the norms or lessons that have come out of these concrete experiences? And of course, this is a place where you want to use your abstract concepts: liberty, justice, truth, freedom, success, independence, right? Those are all very abstract, high exchange value signifiers with many, many, many signifieds. So you want to slide down the ladder of abstraction by talking about reference and non-traditional signifieds, but you also sometimes need to be hanging up in the, hey, you know what this word means, let's just run with that land, right? So one of the things I find the ladder of abstraction really helpful with is writing job cover letters, because in your job cover letter, so in your resume, for example, your resume is basically all concrete. So you're going to list the jobs that you've had, and then underneath them, you're going to list concrete stuff. I hate when under a job as a bartender, people write, developed conflict management skills and customer satisfaction, became customer satisfaction and detail oriented. Those are all abstract, cliche words. They don't belong in a resume because your resume is all evidence. Then what you do is you take all of that concrete language, right, on all of the referent of the things you actually did in your unique specific job, and you use the cover letter to organize them into a couple of signifiers that match the job description. You don't need to have like 20 of them. Nobody wants to read a cover letter about how you're detail oriented and you're an effective communicator and you're curious and you're outgoing and you're a people person. That's way too much, right? That's way too much level of abstraction. So you want to pick 1 or 2, maybe 3 at most, abstract things that all channel into the kind of career that you want, right? So if you're writing the cover letter for the job, you want to pick 2 or 3 abstract keywords like I am for example, for me, it's like I'm intentional with my policies. I'm creative, intentional with my policies. I never make a policy that I don't think works in practice just because it's easy. And then I would move down the ladder of abstraction at that point and give a bunch of details about how that plays out. And then I might want to have another thing that's related to that, where I talk about how I'm accountable, because obviously if I'm going to have these creative policies, I'm going to need to make sure that I get a lot of feedback and that I'm open to revising the policies to continue to improve them. And then I'm going to slide down the ladder of abstraction, and I'm going to give a bunch of details about what jobs and how much and how many students and who said what and what did I do and then why didn't that work and how did I know. That's all of my detail. And then that's going to be my cover letter. So I'm going to have very few abstract concepts or lessons, like just a couple, but I'm going to have for each one of those a lot of concrete referent type language and examples that illustrate what I'm talking about. Because I know, first of all, if I just talk in these abstractions, that yes, I'm going to have high exchange value, but I'm also going to not be like original. Also, because of the issue of the signifieds, I don't want to be throwing around a bunch of words like effective communicator that have so many signifieds that there's no connection, right? Because it could literally mean anything, so I failed to say anything unique and interesting. So I really find the ladder of abstraction very valuable for writing cover letters, like it's a very practical tool. But, just in your interpersonal communication, when you're trying to explain things to people, like maybe you're trying to tell someone why you were upset that day, or maybe you're trying to tell someone why their behavior created problems, or maybe you're trying to explain to a family member why another family member needs you to leave them alone, like whatever it is that you're into. You can use your ladder of abstraction to organize your thoughts in a way that's going to help people understand by moving between your higher level, like here's why it matters, here's the takeaway, and your more specific, here are the details, here are the concrete things that are specific to the situation. So I will leave it at that. I know this has been very theoretically heavy. People don't necessarily love this unit, but part of the reason it's hard is because it's so counterintuitive to how we want to think about language. But, as you walk around in your life and you're looking for signifieds and signifiers that have gotten you into trouble or created miscommunication, you'll start to notice this stuff makes a lot of sense. You just have to be willing to let go of the learned helplessness around higher level thinking and realize this isn't really that complicated. It just requires your brain to work really hard, and we do not like that as human beings. We really, really don't. So even I right now, after explaining this thing that I kind of already understand because I've taught it for 10 years, fucking worn out, man. That was a lot of work. So I know that was a long one. You have a study guide to help you along. Feel free to let me know if any of this needs further clarification. We're going to work on it a little bit in class. And I'd also be interested to know if you have any successes with your ladder of abstraction or your semantic triangle as you engage in interpersonal communication over the next couple of weeks. So let me know how that goes. And I will see you in video 2, which is much shorter.